This is Judy De La Rosa. I'm a Young Living Diamond, and I'm here today with Dr. Neil Carman, and he works as an environmental scientist. Currently, he's been working in this industry for 30 years, and he has his training in a PhD at the University of Texas in plant phytochemistry. And before that, he graduated with a undergraduate degree and a master's degree in botany from the University of Iowa. But he came to Texas with a huge chemistry background because he really wanted to go more in depth into actual essential oil analysis of plants. And at the time, the University of Texas in Austin was the only graduate program in the United States doing this kind of work. In botany. So Dr. Carman is going to take a look at some of these reports that have been coming out, and with his extensive background, he's going to talk to us about some of the results and what his opinions are about them. So Dr. Carman, you're looking here at some of these results of the cinnamon samples that were sent to PhytoChemia, and the allegation that there must be synthetics in there because there's isomers or in there, or small compounds of synthetics, and also possibly the cinnamaldehyde could be synthetic. So can you comment on some of that?
Well, first of all, I would emphasize that trying to use coumarin and the plenol compounds as markers is very poor. These would not hold up as really strong biomarkers in these plants because there is a tremendous amount of genetically based intraspecific variation. That means within the same species, and even in the daily chemistry from one plant to another, the chemistry will vary. And we saw this, that from tree to tree, for example, you could test a cedar or pine, and the chemistry can vary from one day to the next. So anyway, there's a lot of intraspecific genetic variation that these analytic chemists don't really see because they don't go out in the field and do a lot of sampling and testing. They sit in the laboratories, and I was trained very differently. So we saw so much genetic variation within some of the plant chemistries, not just essential oils, but bioflavonoids, non-protein amino acids, and alkaloids, that a lot of these biomarkers are inappropriate. Okay.
So what you're saying is that a lab that isn't trained in actual phytochemistry is very different. Like, because if you're an organic chemist or an inorganic chemist and you're used to studying things that are very stable, which synthetics are, that once you start assessing something that's as variable as an essential oil or a plant chemistry, it is a whole different field that's very specialized, and you really need to know what you're talking about.
A lot of these compounds are very stable, whether they are natural or synthetic, but the problem is that when you go out into nature, you find there's tremendous variability, okay? And you cannot suggest that one different species of cinnamon is contaminated, or a particular oil because it's got the coumarin or the orthomethoxy cinnamaldehyde, because you can have enough variation within the cinnamon species, whether it's Cinnamomum zeylanicum, the Ceylon cinnamon, or the Cinnamomum verum. There's many species of cinnamon, and these species could actually be quite genetically close. The Cinnamomum zeylanicum and the Cinnamomum verum. So this is another issue you get into, is that there is a lot of, and you can see that actually in these gas chromatographs, that a great deal of the chemistry is very, very similar, okay? And so anyway, to me it calls into suspicion how this analytical chemist came to leap to the conclusion that this particular sample of Cinnamomum verum is contaminated with the cassia cinnamon. I think you would want to see some replicated GC analyses So in my view, you couldn't publish this in a peer-reviewed journal, and I don't think any expert could testify in court or wouldn't, based on this is not enough evidence at
So
all.
you're talking about testifying in court because that's actually what you do for a living, right? You represent different concerns where there might be environmental pollution or health concerns by big industry polluting the environment, right?
Right, and so experts who testify in court, they would want to see whether it's an air sample, water sample, or a plant sample. You're going to want to see multiple replicated tests.
And does it have to come from different sources too, not from just one
Well,
chemistry lab?
you know, I think the point is that there's not enough replicates here, not enough information. In some cases, there's no mass spec analysis. There's the gas chromatographic analysis, and one or two of these samples have GCMS, but you really want to see all of them have GCMS analysis, and you want to see replicants, okay, and from different also samples of the cinnamon
Right.
species. So there's just not enough.
Well,
here.
so can you also talk about the small little amounts of the synthetics that are all named, I think, the same thing?
Well, in the one case, this was an unknown initially, in the cinnamomum verum, and it's I would call it almost a trace amount. It's 0.01%. It's a very tiny amount, and at first he identified it as an unknown, and I guess later on he calls it a phenylpropanoid. But but the amounts, the concentrations are extremely small, and so I would want to see a complete GCMS analysis on several samples, okay, of this particular compound to try to figure out what it might be.
And so when Young Living, in their most recent statement on April 29th, they say that this 1245 tetramethylbenzene, which is commonly known as Jarine, is actually from Chemtech Ford known to be a thymine isomer. That would indicate that it couldn't possibly be the synthetic chemical they're saying it is,
Right,
because a
right.
thymine isomer is not ever, it would be
It's
a different substance.
It's a
natural substance.
compound. It's very common, and it would be an easy analytical mistake to make in suggesting that, well, they're both phenylpropanoids, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of being a thymine isomer, he may think it's some kind of a synthetic, but it's not adequate analysis. So
and weren't there a lot of other items in there that were listed as he thought they were synthetics, and you were looking at them saying it didn't make sense because he's got them all labeled the same thing?
Well, yeah, he calls them phenylpentadienols, and he doesn't give the exact structure of each one. And in one case, he does do a GCMS analysis of one of those compounds, but he hasn't clearly identified all of them. And then also, in several of these, there are some unknowns that peaks that he didn't seem to identify. On the Cinnamomum zeylanicum, there's at least four peaks, and he doesn't say what they are. He doesn't appear to try to identify them. So, I think that there's some problems with these analyses. And
so if his whole theory of the cinnamaldehyde and the linalool possibly being synthetic are based on the fact that these minute constituents are synthetic, then if those aren't synthetic, that would disprove the fact that the cinnamaldehyde is a synthetic, correct?
Yes.
That's because there's no way you can tell from the peak of that whether on its own it's only based on what else is with it, whether it's synthetic or not, correct?
Yes.
So that's disproved if those minor constituents are actually a thymine isomer that means it's a natural substance and it's not actually a synthetic. So that's basically disproves the whole thing. And that would corroborate with what the lab in France says, the lab from Young Living says, and Chemtech Ford. So there are three varying different sources disagreeing with the test that was
Well,
done
he did
at
identify two
Phytochemia.
cymene isomers in the cinnamomum zeylanicum,
Yeah.
okay, analysis, and he identified them again, paracymene and metacymene, they're isomers of cymene. He also identified them in the cinnamomum verum, okay, so, and then there's a third cymene isomer, orthocymene, which I don't see in here, so it could be that's what this unknown is. Okay?
Yeah.
It could be orthocymene.
So
okay?
the thing you're saying is that this whole analysis of plant-based substances is extremely difficult, and actually experts will argue amongst themselves often about interpretation. Correct?
Oh yeah. You could change your interpretation after you run different replicated tests, and you'll see even from the same bottle of oil, you could get some slight variation. Would be expected, and
Well, and I think when Young Living actually had Chemtech Ford, or they collected the original bark from several cinnamon trees that were under question, and they tested that, there can be variation even from the same tree or from tree to tree.
yes, within the same tree. I mean, these compounds are well known in the bark chemistry of the cinnamon species, so this kind of variation, in my view, is insignificant. Um, and if he was trying to publish this, it would be the peer review experts would reject it because there's not enough data here. You want a lot more samples, a lot more GCMS tests, and so
So you can't actually say that absolutely this is a adulterated oil from this testing that was done, and it's been misinterpreted in a lot of ways.
I think there's definitely some misinterpretations here, and you want to go back and you want to have more tests run, more samples, and then take a look at it and see if there's some mistakes.
Well, this is really helpful to hear from somebody who's an expert and been working in this field since the 1960s, really, because you started at the University of Iowa and then came to University of Austin in Texas. I mean, at the University of Texas in Austin. But the one other thing that a lot of people are questioning is, why won't Young Living release their tests? And you and I were kind of talking a little bit about that. And, as difficult as it is to interpret these tests, I don't really see what value there might be in releasing them to the public, because the test could be the exact same test. It's a matter of how it's interpreted that makes the difference. Would you
I think
agree with that?
this is like fingerprint analysis, and if you're not an expert, then you're going to make mistakes in the interpretation, and so it's very complicated chemistry, and even the machines themselves can cause some variation in the analyses. Okay, I mean, even just with synthetics, for example, let's say a synthetic benzene. If you're looking at the concentration of benzene from an air sample or something, the analyzer will give you slightly different numbers on the concentration. This is well known. People calibrate these instruments, and so and it could also be that there's some variation due to the person running the machine. So the machines aren't perfect, and there's ways that you can get small amounts of variability. So I've got a lot of questions about these samples and the analyses, that it's not good enough to jump to any conclusions that there is some adulteration present.
Well, and the fact that the person doing these tests makes the assumption that there's cassia in there from the coumarin that's in there, is an indicator to you that his level of knowledge about essential oil testing leaves some room for question, because that doesn't seem very solid to you.
Right, right. Coumarin is extremely common in plants. It's just, I saw it in almost everything we were looking at. It was always
Right.
there. It wasn't a huge
And
amount,
so,
but
yeah.
we would never, in the 1970s, 40 years ago, have considered using coumarin as a marker.
For a marker as to whether it's cinnamon or cassia,
Right,
it's just
right.
inappropriate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, I think that's just a bad analysis
Yeah.
because it's just too common. And even some German researchers were testing different bark samples, and they found it varied quite a bit, which is what I expect. That's
Right.
based on my own experience. So coumarin as a marker is a bad idea.
Right. So in the same way, the idea behind testing the cinnamon and assessing the cinnamaldehyde or the linalool must be synthetic, because of these minute constituents that are so much up for discussion, whether it really appears there are actually natural substances in there that he's misinterpreting, weakens that whole statement about the fact that it was ever synthetic in the first place.
Yeah, I think you would want to see some different instruments, some different GC/MS analyses, maybe different laboratories, and see what they come up with. Because we used to get samples from chemistry labs wanting help on identifying certain compounds.
You mean like the perfume industry in Europe used to come to you guys?
Yeah. Well, also when you start talking about very minor and trace constituents, okay, it's like there's not a lot of material in there. They do a better job today, but this is where you can easily make mistakes in these minor and trace constituents as well. Most people aren't going to be able to read this stuff very well, okay, because there's too much variability. So, somebody would have to study this, and the more you study it and you become trained in it, the more problems you see in jumping to conclusions based upon a few samples.
Yeah. So to make so much put so much truth based on one or two samples is really not appropriate in your opinion.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carman. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
You're welcome.
So just to recap, after our conversation with Dr. Carman today, I think we can see that this field of essential oil analysis, especially plant-based essential oil analysis, is extremely variable and challenging and complex. And to trust the opinion of a chemistry lab that has not spent the last 20, 30 years specializing in this arena over a company like Young Living Essential Oils that has so many years of experience testing and analyzing essential oils and natural plants, that's really beyond the compare of any other. I'd also like to address the issue that Young Living has not released their test results that many people have been asking for. And when you consider the fact that it is so complex to test these, to understand these tests, and that even if the test were very similar to the one that's coming from Phytochemia, it's really the analysis of the test by the person testing that makes the difference. So the possibility of just creating more confusion by releasing the test is there. The other issue is that Young Living has spent over 20 years collecting a library that is very proprietary to them about what standards they hold for each essential oil. And to release that openly to the public is to release one of their proprietary trademarks that gives us the ability to assess our oil quality and uphold our seed to seal promise to everyone. So I think this is something for people to understand also, that it's not like Young Living's trying to hide something by not releasing these tests, but it's really more about being responsible in terms of what we want to make available, because it can be misunderstood so easily by people who are not experienced in this arena and interpreted by people who are not experienced in this arena and cause more confusion. So I choose to trust Young Living's wisdom in their choice to not release those tests. And I stand behind Young Living's continuing promise that we offer the purest, most high quality oils possible in the world today, and why hundreds of thousands of people continue to use Young Living essential oils. They're safe, they're effective, they're powerful, and they're really beyond compare in the world of essential oils today. And that's exactly why Young Living has led the essential oil movement over the last 25 years, and they continue to be the world leader in essential oils.